The rusty gate swung open with a groan that seemed to echo from decades past. Sterling Wade sat motionless in his saddle, staring at the weathered fence posts that once marked the boundary of everything he had loved and lost. His horse, Tempest, snorted nervously beneath him, as if sensing something wrong with this place that should have felt like home. The ranch house stood like a skeleton against the pale morning sky, its windows dark and empty as dead eyes. Weeds had claimed the yard where Ruth once tended her garden, and the wooden porch sagged under the weight of neglect. Sterling had ridden thousands of miles across the frontier, but nothing had prepared him for this moment of reckoning with his past. He dismounted slowly, his weathered boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a sound that seemed too loud in the silence. Tempest pawed the ground restlessly, ears twitching at sounds Sterling could not hear. The stable doors hung askew on broken hinges, revealing nothing but shadows within. Sterling had fled this place the night Ruth died, leaving behind everything except the guilt that rode with him like a second shadow. The official story was an accident, they said, a terrible misfortune that claimed his young wife in the prime of her life. But Sterling knew better. He had seen the fear in her eyes during those final weeks, heard the tremor in her voice when she spoke of their neighbor Malachi Cross. The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the stable and stirring memories Sterling had spent 3 decades trying to bury. Ruth's laughter echoing from the kitchen window, her gentle hands tending to injured animals, the way she would hum while hanging laundry on the line that still stretched between 2 rotting posts. But there had been something else in those final days. Secret meetings Ruth thought he did not notice. Strange visits from Malachi when Sterling was away checking cattle. The hidden letters Ruth burned too quickly when he entered a room. And then on that last terrible night, the sound that had haunted his dreams for 30 years. Sterling approached the stable with leaden steps, each footfall stirring dust that danced in the morning light. Tempest followed reluctantly, nostrils flaring at scents that spoke of old secrets and forgotten truths. The wooden floor creaked ominously under their combined weight, and Sterling wondered if the structure would collapse entirely, burying the past along with his chance for answers. Inside the stable, shafts of sunlight slanted through gaps in the weathered walls, illuminating corners where Ruth once fed their mare and spoke softly to the animals she loved. Sterling ran his hand along the wooden stalls, feeling the grain of timber he had cut and shaped with his own hands during happier times. But Tempest had found something else entirely. The horse moved toward the far corner of the stable, pawing insistently at a section of floor that looked different from the rest. Sterling knelt beside his horse, brushing away decades of accumulated dirt and debris until his fingers found what Tempest had discovered. A hidden hatch perfectly concealed beneath loose boards and dust lay waiting to reveal whatever secrets Ruth had died protecting. Sterling's hands trembled as he pried the wooden boards loose from the hidden hatch. The wood had warped with age, and each plank resisted his efforts as if the past itself fought against being disturbed. Tempest backed away nervously, sensing his master's growing agitation with the instinct that only comes from years of shared hardship on the trail. The final board came free with a sharp crack that echoed through the stable like a gunshot. Sterling peered into the darkness below, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that matched the fearful beating he remembered from that terrible night 30 years ago. The cavity was deeper than he had expected, carved directly into the earth beneath the stable floor. His weathered hands reached into the hidden space, fingers probing the darkness until they closed around something wrapped in oiled canvas. The bundle felt heavy and significant in his grasp, carrying the weight of secrets that had festered in darkness for 3 decades. Sterling pulled it into the light, noting how carefully it had been preserved, as if someone had intended it to survive the years. Inside the canvas wrapping lay a leather journal, bound with Ruth's own hair ribbon. The blue silk faded but still recognizable. Sterling's breath caught in his throat as he recognized his wife's delicate handwriting on the cover. But there was something else in the hidden space, something that made his blood run cold with understanding. A second bundle contained items that had no business being buried beneath their stable floor. Letters bearing Malachi Cross's distinctive handwriting, but addressed to someone Sterling did not recognize. Bank documents that showed transactions Ruth had never mentioned, payments made to accounts in distant towns. And most damning of all, a deed of sale for their ranch, bearing Ruth's forged signature and dated just 1 week before her death. Sterling sat back on his heels, the implications crashing over him like a flash flood in Dry Canyon. Ruth had not been the victim of a simple accident. She had discovered something, uncovered a conspiracy that threatened everything they had built together. The fear he had seen in her eyes during those final weeks now made terrible sense. But as he opened Ruth's journal to the first page, hoofbeats approached from the direction of the main road. Sterling quickly rewrapped the evidence and slipped it beneath his coat, his instincts screaming that whoever was coming might not be pleased to find him here. Tempest whinnied softly, a warning that had saved Sterling's life more than once during his years as a drifter. Through the gaps in the stable walls, Sterling watched as a lone rider approached the ranch. Even at a distance, he recognized the straight-backed posture and deliberate pace of Malachi Cross. Older now, but still carrying himself with the arrogance that had always grated against Sterling's nerves. The man who had been their neighbor, who had attended Ruth's funeral with dry eyes and spoke words of comfort that rang hollow as an empty promise. Malachi rode directly toward the stable, as if he knew exactly where to find the man who had returned after 30 years of absence. Sterling pressed himself against the wall, clutching the evidence of Ruth's final investigation, wondering if Malachi Cross had come to finish what he had started 3 decades ago. Sterling held his breath as Malachi Cross dismounted just outside the stable, his boots hitting the ground with the same measured confidence that had always marked the man's movements. The years had carved deep lines into Malachi's face, but his eyes still held the calculating coldness that Sterling remembered from their final confrontation 30 years ago. "Sterling Wade," Malachi called out, his voice carrying easily through the morning air. "I wondered when you might come back. Some ghosts never rest, do they?" There was no point in hiding. Malachi knew he was there, had probably been watching the ranch for years, waiting for this moment. Sterling stepped out of the shadows, keeping his hands visible but ready, the hidden evidence pressed against his ribs beneath his coat. Tempest followed closely, the horse's instincts as sharp as his master's after decades of dangerous encounters. "Malachi!" Sterling's voice came out rougher than he intended, 30 years of guilt and anger compressed into a single word. "Still playing the concerned neighbor, I see." Malachi smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "I heard you'd been spotted in the territory. Figured you'd end up here eventually. This place has a way of calling people back, doesn't it? Even when they know they shouldn't come." The two men faced each other across the dusty yard, the weight of unspoken accusations hanging between them like smoke from a dying fire. Sterling noticed how Malachi's hand rested casually near his gun, a gesture that appeared relaxed but spoke of readiness to act. Some habits never changed, especially among men who had survived by reading the intentions of others. "I came to make peace with the past," Sterling said carefully, watching for any tell in Malachi's posture. "Ruth deserves that much." Ruth. Malachi spoke her name like a prayer, but Sterling heard the false note beneath the reverence. Poor, sweet Ruth. Such a tragedy. What happened to her? An accident, they said. Sometimes the frontier claims the best of us without warning or reason. Sterling's jaw tightened at the casual mention of his wife's death, the way Malachi spoke of it as if discussing weather or cattle prices. Funny thing about accidents. Sometimes they're not accidents at all. The words hung in the air between them, a challenge thrown down like a gauntlet. Malachi's smile widened slightly, revealing teeth stained yellow with age and tobacco. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, weight settling onto the balls of his feet in the stance of a man preparing for violence. "Careful, Sterling. Grief can make a man say things he doesn't mean. Make him see conspiracies where none exist." Malachi's voice carried a warning wrapped in false sympathy. "You left this place for good reason. Maybe you should have stayed gone." But Sterling had spent 30 years running from the truth, and the evidence beneath his coat felt like fire against his skin. Ruth's journal contained secrets that Malachi Cross had killed to protect, and Sterling would not let her death remain unavenged. He thought of the forged deed, the mysterious bank transactions, the fear that had haunted his wife's final days. "Maybe I should have," Sterling agreed quietly. "But I'm here now, and I intend to find out exactly what happened to my wife." Malachi's hand moved closer to his weapon, the pretense of civility finally dropping away like a discarded mask. The tension stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Sterling could see the calculation in Malachi's eyes, the same cold assessment he remembered from their poker games decades ago. But this was no game, and the stakes were far higher than money or pride. "You always were too stubborn for your own good," Malachi said, his hand now resting openly on his gun grip. Ruth had the same problem, always poking around where she didn't belong, asking questions that didn't need answers. Sterling's blood turned to ice at the admission hidden within Malachi's words. Here was confirmation of what the evidence suggested, spoken with the careless arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. But Sterling had survived 30 years on the frontier by knowing when to fight and when to retreat. "Tempest," he whispered, and the horse immediately understood. Years of partnership had created a language between them that needed no words. The animal shifted position, placing himself between Sterling and Malachi, while appearing to simply graze on the sparse grass. Malachi noticed the movement and laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Still relying on that horse to save you? Some things never change. But you can't run forever, Sterling. This territory isn't big enough for both of us anymore." Sterling backed slowly toward Tempest, his movements casual but purposeful. The evidence beneath his coat felt heavier with each step, as if Ruth's secrets were dragging him down. But he had to get away, had to read her journal completely before deciding how to proceed. Malachi was clearly prepared for violence, and Sterling needed time to plan his next move. "Maybe you're right," Sterling said, swinging himself into the saddle with practiced ease. "Maybe I should leave well enough alone." But even as he spoke the words, Sterling knew he was lying. Ruth's journal burned against his chest like a brand, and the forged deed in his pocket was evidence of crimes that demanded justice. Malachi might have the advantage now, but Sterling had something the other man didn't know about. Malachi relaxed slightly, perhaps believing that Sterling was truly backing down. Smart man. Some dead are better left buried. Sterling turned Tempest toward the road, but not before catching a glimpse of movement near the ranch house. Another rider approached from the east, still distant but closing fast. Malachi followed his gaze and cursed under his breath, apparently not expecting company. "Seems you're popular today," Sterling observed, using the distraction to put more distance between himself and Malachi's gun. The approaching rider wore the uniform of a territorial marshal, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Sterling recognized him as Marshal Davis, a man known for his integrity and stubborn pursuit of justice. But what was he doing here, and why did his presence seem to worry Malachi Cross? "This isn't over," Malachi called out as Sterling guided Tempest toward the tree line. "Some secrets are worth killing for, and some men never learn when to stop digging." Sterling rode hard for the shelter of the cottonwoods. Ruth's journal pressed against his heart and questions multiplying in his mind. As he reached the cover of the trees, he turned back to see Malachi greeting the marshal with forced joviality. Two men sharing words that Sterling could not hear, but desperately needed to understand. Who had summoned Marshal Davis to the ranch, and what did his arrival mean for Sterling's quest for truth? Sterling guided Tempest deep into the cottonwood grove, where thick branches formed a natural shelter from prying eyes. His hands shook as he pulled Ruth's journal from beneath his coat, the leather cover worn smooth by her fingers during those final, fearful weeks. The blue ribbon that bound it was the same one she had worn in her hair on their wedding day. He opened to the first page, and Ruth's familiar handwriting seemed to reach across 30 years of separation. The early entries spoke of ordinary ranch life, but as Sterling read deeper, a pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. Ruth had been investigating land deals throughout the territory, tracking a conspiracy that reached far beyond their small ranch. Malachi came again today while Sterling was checking the north pasture. One entry read, "He offered to buy our land for twice what it's worth. When I refused, his eyes turned cold. He said some accidents happen to people who don't know when to accept good fortune." Sterling's jaw clenched as he read Ruth's careful documentation of threats disguised as neighborly concern. She had discovered that Malachi was working with corrupt territorial officials to force ranchers off valuable land, using intimidation, forged documents, and when necessary, violence. Their ranch sat on a crucial water source that would make someone very wealthy if they controlled it. The journal revealed how Ruth had secretly contacted a territorial marshal, providing evidence of the land-grabbing scheme. She had planned to testify against Malachi and his partners, but she knew the danger she faced. "If something happens to me," she had written, "the truth is hidden where only Sterling would think to look." Sterling understood now why Ruth had chosen the stable floor for her hiding place. It was where they had first kissed, where he had proposed marriage, where she knew his heart would eventually lead him. Even in death, she had been protecting him while ensuring justice would eventually find its way. But the most damning entry came near the end of the journal. Ruth had discovered that Malachi planned to kill her on a specific night, making it appear as if she had been thrown from her horse. She had even identified his accomplice, a man named Vernon Cross, Malachi's younger brother who worked as a territorial clerk with access to official documents. Sterling's hands trembled as he read Ruth's final entry, written on the day of her death. "Sterling, my beloved, If you are reading this, then Malachi has succeeded in silencing me, but he cannot silence the truth forever. The marshal I contacted is Thomas Davis. He has copies of everything I discovered. Find him and finish what I started." Suddenly, the arrival of Marshal Davis at the ranch took on new meaning. This was no coincidence. Davis had been Ruth's secret ally 30 years ago, and somehow he had learned of Sterling's return. The marshal was here to finally bring justice for Ruth's murder, but he would need Sterling's testimony and the evidence from the hidden cache to build his case. Sterling closed the journal and pressed it against his heart, feeling Ruth's presence stronger than he had in 30 years. Sterling tucked the journal back into his coat and urged Tempest toward the edge of the grove. Through the branches, he could see Marshal Davis and Malachi still talking near the ranch house, their body language speaking of tension barely held in check. Davis stood with the confident posture of a lawman who held strong cards, while Malachi's movements had taken on the restless quality of a cornered animal. Ruth had been right to trust Thomas Davis. Sterling remembered the marshal now, a younger man 30 years ago but already known for his integrity and stubborn pursuit of justice. If Davis had kept Ruth's evidence all these years, waiting for the right moment to act, then he was a more patient man than most. But patience would only carry him so far against men like Malachi Cross. Sterling guided Tempest in a wide circle, using the terrain to approach the ranch from an angle that would keep him hidden until the last moment. He needed to reach Davis before Malachi decided that killing a territorial marshal was worth the risk. The evidence hidden beneath the stable floor, combined with Ruth's journal, would be enough to hang Malachi and his accomplices. As he drew closer, Sterling could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the morning wind. Davis was asking pointed questions about land transactions and missing persons, while Malachi provided answers that sounded rehearsed and false. The marshal clearly suspected the truth, but suspicion was not the same as proof. 30 years is a long time to wait for justice, Davis was saying as Sterling reached the edge of the yard. But some crimes are too serious to forget, no matter how much time passes. Malachi laughed, but the sound carried no warmth. "You're chasing shadows, Marshal. Always have been. Some cases are better left closed." Sterling stepped into view, leading Tempest by the reins. Both men turned toward him, but their reactions could not have been more different. Davis nodded grimly, as if he had been expecting this moment. Malachi's hand dropped immediately to his gun, his face twisting with fury and fear. "Sterling Wade," Davis said formally, "I've been hoping you would return. We have unfinished business regarding your wife's death." The words hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, marking the end of 30 years of deception. Malachi's eyes darted between the two men, calculating odds and distances, looking for an escape that did not exist. He was outnumbered now, and Sterling could see the moment when desperation began to replace confidence. "You have no proof of anything," Malachi snarled. "Ruth Wade died in an accident, and that's the end of it." Sterling reached into his coat and withdrew the forged deed, holding it where both men could see. "This says otherwise, along with the bank records and the letters you thought were safely buried." Davis stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his weapon. "Malachi Cross, you're under arrest for the murder of Ruth Wade and conspiracy to defraud territorial landowners. You have the right to surrender peacefully." But Sterling could see in Malachi's eyes that surrender was not an option the man would consider. 30 years of freedom had made him arrogant, and arrogant men rarely went quietly to the gallows. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the yard where three men faced their moment of reckoning. Malachi's hand moved toward his gun in a motion that seemed to unfold like a deadly flower blooming. Sterling had seen that look before, in the eyes of desperate men who would rather die than face the consequences of their crimes. But 30 years on the frontier had honed Sterling's reflexes to a razor's edge, and he was already moving when Malachi's fingers closed around his weapon. The shot rang out across the empty ranch, echoing off the weathered buildings like thunder in a canyon. But it was Marshal Davis who had drawn and fired, his bullet catching Malachi in the shoulder and spinning him around before he could clear leather. The older man dropped to his knees, clutching his wounded arm and cursing with the fury of a man whose plans had finally crumbled to dust. "Should have taken the peaceful option," Davis said calmly, keeping his gun trained on Malachi while Sterling moved to secure the fallen man's weapon. 30 years of running from justice ends today. Sterling kicked Malachi's gun away, feeling a satisfaction that ran deeper than mere revenge. This was justice for Ruth, delayed, but not denied. The evidence in his coat would ensure that Malachi faced trial for his crimes, and the conspiracy that had cost his wife her life would finally be exposed to the light. Malachi glared up at them through eyes bright with pain and hatred. You think this changes anything? There are others involved, men with more power than you can imagine. They'll never let this reach trial. Let me worry about that, Davis replied, pulling a pair of iron shackles from his saddle. Vernon Cross is already in custody in Tucson, and he's been quite talkative about your land scheme. Seems 30 years of guilt finally caught up with him. Sterling felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. Vernon Cross, Malachi's brother and accomplice, had confessed to their crimes. That explained why Davis had known to come here now, why he had been confident enough to confront Malachi directly. The marshal had spent 3 decades building an airtight case, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Davis secured the shackles around Malachi's wrists, Sterling noticed movement in the distance. A wagon approached from the main road, driven by 2 men wearing deputy badges. Davis had not come alone after all. He had planned for every contingency, including the possibility that Malachi would resist arrest. My wife was innocent, Sterling said quietly, looking down at the man who had destroyed so many lives for money and land. She was trying to protect people from men like you. Malachi spat blood into the dust, his face twisted with unrepentant malice. She was a fool who couldn't mind her own business. Just like you. The words hit Sterling like physical blows, but they also freed him from the last chains of doubt that had bound him for 30 years. Ruth had died a hero, fighting corruption and injustice. Her murder had not been his fault, and her sacrifice had not been in vain. The deputies pulled their wagon to a stop beside the group, ready to transport their prisoner to face territorial justice. The deputies loaded Malachi into their wagon with professional efficiency, ignoring his continued threats and curses. Marshal Davis handed over the evidence Sterling had provided, along with his own carefully preserved documentation of the conspiracy. 30 years of patient investigation would finally see daylight in a territorial courtroom. The trial will be in Tucson next month, Davis told Sterling as they watched the wagon disappear down the dusty road. Your testimony will be crucial, but with Vernon's confession and Ruth's evidence, justice is finally within reach. Sterling nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he had carried for 3 decades. Ruth's death would be avenged, and her courage in facing down corruption would be remembered. The land-grabbing scheme that had claimed multiple victims across the territory would be exposed, and other families would finally have answers about their own losses. What will you do now? Davis asked, gesturing toward the abandoned ranch buildings. This place legally belongs to you again. The forged deed Malachi used has no standing in law. Sterling looked around the property where he had once been happy, where Ruth had tended her garden and hummed while hanging laundry. The buildings were weathered and worn, but the bones of their home remained solid. The water source that had made the land valuable still flowed clear and strong. I think I'll stay, Sterling said slowly, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. Ruth always said this land had good bones. Maybe it's time to rebuild what was lost. Tempest whinnied softly and nudged Sterling's shoulder, as if approving of the decision. The horse had been his companion through years of wandering, but even Tempest seemed ready to rest in a place where grass grew green and water ran clean. Davis mounted his horse and tipped his hat respectfully. Ruth would be proud of what you've accomplished here today. Justice delayed is not justice denied, as long as good men refuse to give up the fight. As the marshal rode away toward Tucson and the coming trial, Sterling walked slowly back to the stable where Tempest had discovered the hidden hatch that changed everything. He knelt beside the opening and carefully replaced the loose boards, sealing away the cavity that had preserved Ruth's final gift to him. The truth had been revealed, justice would be served, and Sterling Wade had finally come home. After 30 years of running from his past, he was ready to build a future worthy of the woman who had died protecting others. Ruth's courage lived on in the justice they had achieved together, and her memory would guide him as he rebuilt their ranch into something she would recognize and love. Sterling led Tempest to the old corral and began planning the work that lay ahead, his heart finally at peace. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us,